anyone have any questions before we wrap up?
Allie, does immigration status affect somebody's qualifying for McKinney-Vento?
No. No, and in fact, that can be an automatic qualification, because it's one of the things is if they're from a disaster, so, or homeless because of a disaster. So a lot of the refugees coming because of they're fleeing war or bad circumstances, they automatically qualify. We do not discriminate.
Anyone else?
Is the discrimination piece different when you have, for example, the landlord who is living in their own property, and someone stated there was a difference there? I heard 48 hours.
That was just for notice, of an eviction or anything like that. Yeah.
So is it different in discrimination when a landlord lives within the property versus when it's a building?
No, that's a good question. There's no difference between when it's a smaller mom and pop landlord who lives in that building and maybe rents out the lower unit, or a large corporation. They still are not allowed. They still have to follow that process where they pre-qualify you first before running the background check. And something I didn't mention in the presentation is that the landlord has to give that background check, a copy of that background check back to you if you apply within 5 days of running it. So the idea is that the landlord gives, I really sped past it in my presentation, we'll edit this back in, but the idea is that the landlord gives the applicant their background check so you can both see what they were looking at when they pulled the background check. That person has 5 days to submit additional information, challenge the accuracy of it. So if it's this is something from more than 3 years ago, don't consider it, or this is somebody with my name but it's not me, you have 5 days to give them that information. And then the landlord, at that point, if they are going to make a decision based on a conviction from within the last 3 years, they have to give you that written individualized assessment. So there's a lot of moving pieces. But the main takeaway is that they're supposed to give you a copy of the background check so you can see what they're looking at when they make their decision.
So I wonder, what are the rights of the landlord? Because I never really hear that piece. Not that I'm a landlord. But what are the rights of the landlord? Because it seems that the laws or the procedures that are being developed for tenants is getting wider and wider and wider. And in this, we work in crisis. So in dealing with landlords who call, or people who are property owners who are fearful, and they have real reasons, we deal with mental health. So how a person can have they can have a situation that would inhibit or provoke a landlord to not want to rent, or to cancel their lease because of these acts. I'm wondering what is it with the landlord? What rights do they have in regards to that? If it's a blanket, because it's coming across like a blanket discrimination. You cannot discriminate about anything, even though it may not be a discrimination on the side of the landlord. It may be a protective mechanism. If I'm making sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can only speak to the really small slice of, so maybe, I don't know, Kevin, if you can jump in, but go ahead.
I think, in almost, all leases and in, most city ordinances that deal with housing and whatnot, there's going to be something that talks about, disturbing the peace and disturbing, your neighbors and things like that. And so, if this manic episode is something that is, really causing a disturbance and something that continues to happen or something like that, then, the landlord's not going to be, stuck there with their hands tied. They will have opportunities and options to, pursue evictions and, get their property back if that's what they so choose to do.
Yeah, thank you. And vice versa, because we are obtaining a lot of calls where people have crises and the landlord becomes discriminatory because that person had an onset of bipolar or an onset of schizophrenia, and then they want to end the lease. They're using it as a lease violation, even though it's not a violation. The person had a mental break.
Yeah, and that can be kind of related back to disability rights. So with disability being one of those federally protected classes, within housing, someone has a right to a reasonable accommodation. So if they were having a manic episode, but there's some kind of accommodation that can be made, maybe getting connected with supportive services or getting back on medication or something like that, that can be an accommodation to help them stay in their housing. They might have a case for an advocate to argue, hey, like this manic episode was a result of this disability. They have a right to a reasonable accommodation or modification. And sometimes it can get a little tricky, sometimes a little bit in some of those disputes. But those are, that is something that if someone is just experiencing discrimination due to a mental health episode and they need support with advocacy around reasonable accommodations, definitely any fair housing organization, you can connect them with us and we can kind of support with that extra advocacy around RAs and RMs. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just jump back to the fair housing ordinance. And landlords can decide not to rent to people for any reason that's not like one of those protected classes or now criminal records. It just has to happen before the background check is run, so that every party knows that it's because of some other reason that this landlord doesn't want a person living there. Like sometimes it just doesn't work out for other reasons. It just has to be in that procedure. So that would, I guess, be my advice if there are any landlords who are somehow watching this, is really follow that procedure, because it's very, very, it's a little confusing, but it's how I look at it as like an advocate for people who are denied housing. Is I really pay attention to whether they've dotted their I's and crossed their T's, because that's where a lot of people tend to fall down, I guess.
I have a question directed to Connections, and this is just part of my ignorance. I'm familiar with a family where I believe the city of Evanston is paying for them. It's a homeless family. Is paying for them to be housed in a hotel. And so is that something? Is that like another possible resource for people to go to the city of Evanston directly, or do they get referred by a school social worker, or?
You might.
I'm just curious how that works, and is there a set amount of time that the city is willing to help people? Does the city work with Connections in that situation? Or?
So I can't speak for the city of Evanston. I can speak that Connections typically does not pay for hotel stays because we just don't have the funding to do that, and unless there's a definitive end date. If someone is experiencing homelessness and there's no end date of when they're going to leave the hotel, then that's kind of why we would not pay for that. And we run into the same issues of people because we really don't have emergency shelter. I mean, we have options, but there's like rarely, if ever, openings. Like we have the Margarita, but you have to be engaging in our services and meeting with a case manager in order to get connected to that wait list. So I can speak to that, but again, it's not an immediate solution and it's a long wait. There's also the overnight shelter, because I think you mentioned a family. So if they have minor children,
Yes.
The Margarita would be like the only option to shelter households. But again, they have to engage in our services in order to get connected to that wait list. And it's a little bit different for families with minor children. But again, it's not a quick, I can't speak to the wait list. I can't necessarily speak to how quickly it moves, because again, it's kind of a different program than what I manage, but it's just not a quick solution. Do you have more information about the city
I
of
would
Evanston?
say, yes, the city of Evanston has emergency assistance and general assistance, and it's on the city of Evanston website. It is a lot of paperwork to fill out, and you have to provide social security cards, driver's license, outstanding bills, things like that. Yeah, but it's definitely really helpful, and they are helping a lot of families in a lot of different ways. I would say about a family staying in a hotel, A, they qualify for McKinney-Vento if they have children in school, and B, they qualify as literally homeless, so then they can start the coordinated entry process.
Oh, right. Yeah, they should come to Connections anyway, because they are technically, they're literally homeless if someone else is paying for the hotel. But again, it's still not an immediate housing solution. And coordinated entry is a way to get connected to housing programs, but again, we have no control over it. The Alliance to End Homelessness of Suburban Cook County manages that, and it all has to do with like vulnerability, and there's just a lot of assessments that get done to get matched with a housing option.
Okay, so they are McKinley then, so, I mean, they already are receiving
Yeah.
that aid, so does that mean that, somebody has connected them with housing possibilities as part of what you do?
Probably. Yeah, I mean, if I'm working with a family, I will be and they've given a consent to release information, I'll be in contact with Connections about them and trying to figure out like which program. they fit best into. And then we'll offer the other like stuff that we offer as a school, transportation,
Thank you.
tutoring, clothes.
Any final questions?
I had a question about the 3 years is only for criminal records, right? Not for like evictions.
No. And it's not for credit either. I think like credit checks, eviction checks, and background checks kind of all get lumped together in a lot of people's minds, but they're all separate, so it wouldn't apply to that. But good question. All right. Well, thanks for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all for your work.